Snoop Dogg stepped onto the private jet, ready for a trip he had been looking forward to for months. It was finally time to relax after a whirlwind schedule of concerts, studio sessions, and endless work commitments. The Maldives, sun, sand, and silence awaited him, and he couldn't wait to kick back and recharge. Snoop slid into the soft leather seat, leaned back, and adjusted his sunglasses. He scrolled through his phone, pulling up a playlist to set the mood. The cabin was pure luxury, elegant lighting, spacious seating, and a crew that seemed ready to cater to his every need. A flight attendant soon appeared with a bright smile, holding a glass of juice. "Here you go, Mr. Broadus, let us know if you need anything at all," she said warmly. Snoop grinned as he accepted the drink, raising it playfully like he was making a toast. "Y'all really outdid yourselves here," he said smoothly. The plane began to taxi, the engines humming softly as it rolled down the runway. Snoop glanced briefly at the other passengers, a mix of business professionals and travelers who seemed more focused on their phones and laptops than the presence of a world-famous rap star. The jet lifted into the air smoothly, and Snoop felt a mix of relief and excitement. It felt good to leave everything behind for a while. He grabbed his tablet, jotting down notes for a song. The steady drone of the engines and the soft vibration of the plane acted like inspiration, helping him clear his mind and get creative. This was just what he needed. A few hours into the flight, the lights dimmed as the cabin settled into nighttime mode. Snoop reclined his seat and closed his eyes, letting the gentle motion of the jet lull him into a light nap. The flight attendants moved quietly, making sure no one was disturbed as passengers drifted into their own routines. Suddenly, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice broke the quiet. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've now left U.S. airspace and are cruising at 35000 feet. The weather ahead is clear, and we're on track to arrive in the Maldives in just under 8 hours. Thank you for flying with us. If you need anything, our crew is here to help." Some passengers nodded and murmured quietly, while others glanced out their windows at the moonlit ocean below. Snoop stretched slightly in his seat, appreciating the smooth ride and the calm atmosphere. For a while, everything felt perfect. Then, something unexpected happened. The cockpit door opened and the captain himself stepped out. He was a tall man, mid-40s, with neatly combed hair and a serious expression. At first, it seemed like a standard gesture, a friendly walk-through to greet the passengers. The captain smiled and exchanged pleasantries as he made his way down the aisle. But when he reached Snoop's row, he stopped. The captain's gaze lingered a little too long. His friendly smile faltered, replaced by something colder. Snoop slid his sunglasses down just a bit, offering the captain a polite nod. "Everything good, man?" Snoop asked casually. The captain's tone was polite, but there was an edge to it. "Enjoying the flight, sir?" "Sure am," Snoop replied, his usual charm shining through. "Y'all run a tight ship." But the captain didn't move on. Instead, his expression grew harder, his lips pressing into a thin line. The mood shifted, like a cloud passing over the calm cabin. "I have to ask," the captain said slowly, his voice firm, "who exactly are you and why are you on this flight?" Straight. Snoop blinked, caught off guard. I'm Snoop Dogg," he said, gesturing toward himself. "Booked this flight fair and square. Everything's legit, man." The captain's frown deepened. He crossed his arms, his gaze unrelenting. "You'll have to forgive me," the captain said, his voice growing colder, "if I don't just take your word for it." Snoop sat up straighter, the tension in the air becoming impossible to ignore. Around him, a few passengers glanced up from their seats, sensing the sudden unease. Snoop held his composure, his voice calm but firm. "Look, man, you got my info. Check with the people who booked this flight. I'm supposed to be here." The captain said nothing else. After a moment, he turned sharply and disappeared back into the cockpit, leaving a strange, uneasy silence behind him. He stepped onto the scaffold and quickly received the cap. Snoop sighed and leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. Something about the captain's behavior didn't sit right with him, but he told himself not to dwell on it. Still, the tension lingered, and a voice in the back of his mind told him this wasn't over. And it wasn't. The tension in the cabin grew thick, and a few passengers shot sideways glances at Snoop, their curiosity piqued. He stayed calm, though his jaw clenched slightly. He had dealt with critics before, but this felt different. This was hostility. "Look," Snoop said evenly, keeping his tone steady. "You've got the paperwork, right? Go ahead and check it. Everything's legit. No need to make a scene over nothing." The captain didn't budge. Instead, he glanced around the cabin as if searching for someone to back him up. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath, before turning on his heel and walking briskly back to the cockpit. Snoop exhaled deeply and leaned back, trying to shake off the encounter. Something about it gnawed at him. But he reminded himself that he had done nothing wrong. This was supposed to be a trip for relaxation, not stress. Around him, the cabin slowly settled back into its quiet rhythm. Passengers returned to their books, movies, or conversations, though a few stole curious glances in his direction. Sliding his sunglasses back on, Snoop closed his eyes, hoping to reclaim the calm, but that little voice in his mind whispered again, this wasn't over. Something was coming. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, and most passengers appeared to relax. Some dozed off, others kept their eyes on screens. Snoop grabbed his phone and scrolled through his beats, hoping the music would keep his mind busy. Then the intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Broaddus, please remain seated. I will be speaking with you shortly," the captain's voice announced, sharper this time. Heads turned. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Snoop sat up straighter, his brow furrowed. This wasn't just unusual, it felt personal now. Within moments, the captain re-emerged from the cockpit. His face was rigid, and his sharp eyes locked onto Snoop like a spotlight. Two flight attendants trailed behind him, looking nervous. The captain strode to Snoop's seat, his stance stiff with authority. "Mr. Broaddus," the captain began, his voice clipped and cold, "I have some questions regarding your presence on this flight." Snoop let out a slow breath, maintaining his calm. "Man, I already told you I booked this flight fair and square. You can check with the charter company, everything's solid." The captain's lips curled into a smirk. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "A man like you? Flying first class on a private jet? Let's be honest, you don't exactly look the part." Snoop blinked, stunned by the sheer audacity of the words. Around him, the cabin fell silent, and passengers froze in place. The tension was suffocating. "A man like me?" Snoop echoed, his voice quiet but edged with disbelief. "What's that supposed to mean?" The captain leaned in slightly, his tone hardening. "You know exactly what it means. You don't belong here. I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not buying it." Snoop shook his head slowly, frustration building. "I don't know what your problem is, but I've got receipts, man. Paperwork. Whatever you need, you're the one making this a thing." The captain crossed his arms, his expression unmoved. "I don't care what papers you claim to have. People like you, troublemakers, criminals, you're all the same. You think money buys you access to places you don't belong. Not on my watch." Snoop clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. He had seen prejudice before, but this was something else entirely. Bold, unprovoked, and out in the open. "You don't know me, man," Snoop said quietly, his voice steady despite his anger. "I'm minding my business. I paid for this flight. You're the one making it a problem." The captain leaned closer, his face mere inches away, his words venomous. "I know enough. You're just a thug with money, and money doesn't buy respect. Not from me." Scratch that. The tension was suffocating. Some passengers began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others openly stared. A flight attendant stepped forward, hesitant, her voice trembling. "Captain," she said softly, "maybe we should stay out of this." "Stay out of it?" the captain barked, silencing her instantly. Snoop rose slowly, his tall frame towering over the captain. Despite the boiling anger in his chest, he kept his composure. "I'm done talking to you," Snoop said firmly. "If you've got a problem, sort it out with the people who booked this flight. I'm not here for your drama." But the captain wasn't backing down. His face turned red with anger, and he jabbed a finger into Snoop's chest. "You think you can intimidate me?" the captain hissed, his voice rising. "You're just another punk who thinks he's above the rules." That was it, the floodgates opened, the captain launched into a tirade, his words venomous and cruel. Gangster, drug dealer, scum, each insult struck like a blow. Snoop stood frozen, his fists trembling, but he refused to react. He clenched his jaw and stayed silent, refusing to give the captain the satisfaction. Finally, the captain straightened, a smug look on his face. "I'll deal with this my way," he said coldly before turning and stalking back to the cockpit. Snoop sank into his seat, his hands shaking with restrained anger. Around him, passengers whispered in shock and discomfort. The flight attendants avoided his gaze, clearly unwilling to intervene. Snoop turned toward the window, staring out at the darkness. His mind raced. He had come on this trip to escape, to relax, and now he was trapped in a situation that felt like a cruel joke. The plane glided smoothly through the sky, but for Snoop, the turbulence had already begun. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the venom of the captain's words lingering in the air like poison. Snoop's thoughts ran wild. How many times had this happened to others? How many people endured this kind of treatment without a voice to fight back? Before he could fully process it, the intercom blared again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest airstrip due to a safety concern." The announcement sent ripples of confusion through the cabin. Murmurs spread as passengers exchanged uncertain glances, but Snoop knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't about safety. It was personal. Moments later, the captain re-emerged, his face colder than ever. He strode down the aisle rigid and unyielding. "You," he barked, pointing a finger at Snoop. "Get your things. You're getting off this plane." Snoop remained seated, his face calm despite the fire boiling inside him. "Man, I ain't going anywhere," he said. "I paid for this flight, just like everybody else here." The captain's eyes narrowed, his lips curled into a sneer. "I said get up now or I'll make you." The tension hit its peak. Passengers shrank back into their seats, clearly unwilling to intervene. A couple of them seemed ready to speak up, but the captain's authority and the suffocating tension kept them silent. When Snoop didn't move, the captain lunged forward. He grabbed Snoop by the arm and yanked him roughly out of his seat. "You're a danger to this flight, and I'm not taking any chances," the captain growled. The sudden violence caught Snoop off guard, but he quickly steadied himself, pulling his arm free. "Danger," Snoop said through gritted teeth. "The only danger here is you." The captain's response was swift and brutal. He shoved Snoop hard, sending him stumbling into the aisle. The passengers gasped audibly, but still, no one moved. Snoop could see the fear in their eyes. They didn't want to be next. Snoop pushed himself up, his voice steady despite the ache in his side. "I'm not gonna fight you, man," Snoop said, "but you're gonna regret this." The captain smirked, arrogance written all over his face. "We'll see about that." The plane began its descent, tilting slightly as it approached the unknown landing site. Snoop stood tall, his gaze fixed on the captain, refusing to look defeated. He wasn't about to give the man the satisfaction. When the plane finally landed, the door was opened and humid jungle-like air filled the cabin. The captain grabbed Snoop's belongings and tossed them onto the tarmac without a word. "Out," he barked. Snoop stood in the doorway, the oppressive heat washing over him. He looked back at the captain, his voice low but firm. "This ain't over." The captain shoved him toward the exit. "Get out before I call the authorities." With no choice, Snoop stepped onto the tarmac, his bag clutched in his hand. The plane door slammed shut behind him, and within moments, the engines roared to life. Snoop watched as the jet lifted into the air, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere. Snoop Dogg stood at the edge of the open doorway, the dense jungle surrounding the small, desolate airstrip. The heat pressed against him, heavy and stifling, making his clothes cling to his skin. He glanced back at the captain, his expression calm but his voice deadly steady. "You think this is over?" Snoop said, his tone low and sharp. "It ain't." The captain sneered, his lip curling with disdain as he shoved Snoop roughly toward the door. "Get out before I call the authorities," the captain barked. Snoop stood his ground for a moment, his fists clenching at his sides, but with no choice, he stepped out onto the tarmac. The heavy slam of the plane door behind him echoed like a final insult. The engines roared back to life, and within minutes, the jet began to move, picking up speed until it lifted off the ground and disappeared into the sky. Snoop stood frozen in place, watching the aircraft until it became a distant speck. He clutched his bag tightly, his mind racing to process the situation. The sheer disbelief of what had just happened weighed down on him like a boulder. Humiliation burned through him, mixed with a sharp, simmering anger. For the first time in a long time, Snoop Dogg felt powerless. The airstrip was abandoned. Other than the faint hum of insects and distant animal calls, it was dead silent. Snoop scanned his surroundings, his eyes landing on a small shed to the side of the clearing. Its roof sagged, and its door hung loosely on one hinge. Beyond that, nothing but an endless wall of dense jungle greeted him. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head. "What the hell did I get myself into?" His feet crunched on the gravel as he made his way toward the shed, his bag slung over his shoulder. Hope flickered in him that maybe someone, anyone, might be around to help. But as he pushed the shed's creaking door open, he was met with emptiness. Dust, cobwebs, and rotting wood were all that remained. The reality hit him hard. He had been left completely alone in the middle of nowhere. Snoop dropped his bag and leaned against the doorframe, wiping sweat from his brow. He glanced out at the jungle, the oppressive heat making it hard to think straight. A mixture of frustration and disbelief welled up inside him. "Unbelievable," he muttered to himself. "That man really did me dirty." With no other option, Snoop began walking, his steps slow and steady as he made his way along the edge of the jungle. The gravel crunched beneath his sneakers, the sound somehow louder in the eerie silence. He walked for hours, aimlessly searching for anything that looked like civilization. The heat bore down on him, sapping his energy with every step. His clothes stuck to his skin, damp with sweat, and his muscles ached from the earlier struggle with the captain. His thoughts drifted as he trudged forward. He thought about his family, his fans, and everything he had built over the years. All the struggles he had overcome, the battles he had fought, and now this? Abandoned on a forgotten airstrip, all because one man couldn't accept that someone like him belonged on that plane. The hours dragged on. The sun began to dip below the horizon, and the shadows of the jungle grew longer and darker. The sounds of the wilderness shifted, the soft hum of insects replaced by rustling leaves and distant unfamiliar animal calls. Snoop finally stopped in a small clearing, his legs too tired to carry him any further. He dropped his bag and sat heavily against the trunk of a wide tree. Above him, the thick jungle canopy blocked most of the sky, but he could make out a few faint stars twinkling through the leaves. Exhausted and bruised, Snoop stared upward, his breathing slow and steady. Despite everything, he refused to let despair take hold. "Nah," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "I ain't going out like this. I'll get out of here, and when I do, that captain's gonna wish he never crossed me." The night deepened, the jungle coming alive with its strange and unsettling symphony. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves set Snoop on edge. The sounds were alien to him, and the darkness made it impossible to see where they came from. He gripped his bag tightly, scanning his surroundings with wary eyes. Hours passed in the pitch black, but Snoop pressed on, stumbling through the underbrush. He didn't know where he was going, but standing still wasn't an option. His body ached, his energy was nearly gone, and his mind felt clouded with fatigue. Then he saw it. Light, faint and distant, it flickered through the trees like a beacon of hope. Snoop's heart leapt, and he forced his legs to move faster, ignoring the sharp pains shooting through them. The closer he got, the brighter the light became. It wasn't just a single light, it was several, glowing like lanterns. He could hear faint sounds now, too. Music, laughter, and the rhythmic beat of drums. Finally, he emerged into another clearing. A small village stood before him, a handful of huts lit by firelight. People moved about, talking, laughing, and dancing to the beat of the drums. The air felt alive, a stark contrast to the silence he had just come from. Snoop hesitated at the edge of the village, unsure of how they would react to a stranger stumbling out of the jungle, but he had no other choice. Gathering what little strength he had left, he stepped forward into the clearing, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. The music stopped. All eyes turned to him, the sudden silence heavy with tension. For a moment no one spoke. Then, from the edge of the group, a young man's eyes widened as he stared at Snoop. "Yo, is that Snoop Dogg?" the young man said, his voice full of disbelief. The words hung in the air for just a moment before breaking the tension completely. The villagers erupted into murmurs, their faces shifting from shock to excitement. "It is Snoop Dogg," someone else exclaimed. People began to move toward him, their curiosity overtaking their hesitation. A few held up phones, snapping pictures or recording videos, while others simply stared, their faces a mix of awe and concern. Snoop managed a tired smile, lowering his hands as he looked around at the gathering crowd. "Yeah, it's me," he said, his voice hoarse but calm. "Long story, y'all wouldn't believe half of it." A tall man stepped forward, his expression serious but kind. "You all right, brother?" he asked, extending a hand. "You look like you've been through it." Snoop took the man's hand and nodded gratefully. "Man, you don't even know," Snoop said with a small chuckle, "but I'm still standing." The villagers quickly sprang into action. Someone brought Snoop a bowl of water, while others laid out food and blankets near a fire. As he sat down, surrounded by the warmth of their hospitality, Snoop finally allowed himself to relax for the first time since stepping off that plane. He stared into the flames, the weight of the day lifting ever so slightly. "This ain't over," he said quietly, shaking his head as he thought about the captain, "not by a long shot." Snoop Dogg lingered at the village's edge, his tired body nearly collapsing under the weight of the day. The tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward with a friendly, yet concerned look. "Man, what happened to you? You look like you've been through a war," he said, his deep voice carrying across the clearing. Snoop let out a faint chuckle, though exhaustion was written all over his face. Lowering his hands, he shrugged weakly. "Yeah, it's close enough to that," he replied. "Got kicked off a plane by some racist pilot. Threw me out in the middle of nowhere. I'm just trying to get home." The crowd of villagers fell into a shocked silence, their faces a mix of disbelief and anger. Their expressions hardened, and the murmurs of outrage spread like wildfire. The tall man stepped closer and laid a reassuring hand on Snoop's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "You're safe here, brother," he said, his tone steady and reassuring. "We'll look after you. Come on. Let's get you cleaned up and fed." Snoop nodded, his gratitude apparent, though he was too drained to fully express it. The man led him toward one of the larger huts. Inside, a small group of women quickly gathered to help. They worked with care and quiet efficiency, cleaning the cuts on Snoop's arms and face and offering him a bowl of cool water. "Drink up," one of the women said gently, handing him a wooden cup. Another placed a plate of food in front of him, rice, grilled vegetables, and seasoned meat. The aroma made his stomach growl, and he dug in slowly, savoring every bite. His body was too drained to do much more than offer a small nod of thanks. Word of Snoop's arrival seemed to spread like wildfire. Villagers of all ages gathered near the hut, peeking in curiously. They began bringing small offerings, gifts of fruit, hand-carved trinkets, and even woven cloth. Each gesture, though simple, touched Snoop deeply. For the first time since being abandoned, he felt something close to peace. After a while, the tall man returned, this time with a group of older villagers who appeared to be leaders of the community. He sat across from Snoop, his face serious yet kind. "I'm Jamal," he introduced himself. "We heard what happened. That pilot, man, that ain't right. He's gonna pay for what he did to you, but first things first, we're gonna make sure you get home safe." Snoop leaned back slightly, nodding in gratitude. "Appreciate y'all more than I can say," he replied. "Didn't think anyone would even find me out here, let alone help." Jamal offered a faint smile. "Don't worry, brother, you're one of us now. We take care of our own, Cecile," he said. "Give us a couple of days and we'll have everything sorted. Local authorities, flights, we'll handle it." Over the next few days, the villagers went above and beyond to help. They reached out to local authorities, arranged for transportation, and even pooled together resources to cover Snoop's flight back to the United States. In that short time, Snoop became part of the village. Despite his lingering exhaustion, he spent time with the people, laughing, telling stories, and listening to theirs in return. Before his departure, the villagers threw a celebration in his honor. The clearing was alive with music, dancing, and food, a stark contrast to the loneliness Snoop had felt just days earlier. He joined in, sharing laughter and stories with his newfound friends. For the first time in a long time, he felt welcomed, like he belonged. The day of his departure arrived too soon. As Snoop prepared to leave, Jamal and several others accompanied him to the small airstrip where a plane waited. Snoop turned to face Jamal and the villagers who had gathered to see him off, his expression filled with gratitude. "Y'all didn't have to do all this," Snoop said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget this, what you did for me." Jamal grinned, clapping Snoop firmly on the back. "Just remember, you've got family here now. Anytime you need us, we've got your back," he said. Snoop smiled, shaking Jamal's hand. "Respect, man, that means everything," he said. The flight back home was smooth and uneventful, a complete contrast to the nightmare that had stranded him in the jungle. As the plane soared through the clouds, Snoop gazed out the window, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just going to let this incident slide. He couldn't. The world needed to hear what had happened. That captain? He was going to face justice. When the wheels touched down on U.S. soil, Snoop felt an overwhelming mix of relief and determination. The familiar skyline came into view, reminding him that he was back where he belonged. This wasn't just a return home. It was the start of something bigger. As Snoop stepped off the plane, limping slightly from the lingering aches, he was greeted by a small crowd near the terminal. Fans who had caught wind of his disappearance cheered as soon as they saw him. Some held signs that read, "Welcome home, Snoop," while others waved and snapped photos. "Good to be back," Snoop muttered under his breath, forcing a smile as he waved to the crowd. Just beyond the fans, Snoop's manager Kevin stood waiting, his face a mix of relief and frustration. As Snoop approached, Kevin pulled him into a tight hug. "Man, are you okay?" Kevin asked, stepping back to get a good look at him. "We've been hearing crazy stuff. What happened out there?" Snoop sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's a long story, Kev," he said. "That pilot, racist as hell, threw me off the plane in the middle of nowhere. If it wasn't for some real ones I met out there, I don't know where I'd be." Kevin's jaw tightened, his fists clenching in anger. "You serious? That's not just bad, that's criminal. We can't let this go, Snoop." Snoop nodded firmly, his tone resolute. "Already on it. Get the lawyers ready. I'm taking this public." The car ride back home was quiet except for the constant buzz of Kevin's phone as he coordinated with legal teams, PR reps, and media contacts. Snoop stared out the window, his mind replaying every moment on that plane. Every insult, every shove, every ounce of humiliation. But instead of anger, he felt resolve. Once he got home, there would be no rest. He was ready to fight back, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been treated the way he had. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He went straight to his office. Kevin set up a camera, and within minutes Snoop was live on all his social media platforms. His millions of followers poured into the stream, flooding the chat with messages of concern and support. Snoop adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. "Yo, what's up everybody? It's your boy Snoop. I know y'all been wondering where I've been the past few days, and I gotta tell you, this ain't a story I ever thought I'd have to share. But y'all need to hear this." He recounted everything, the captain's hostility, the violent confrontation, being abandoned in the jungle, and the kindness of the locals who helped him survive. His voice stayed steady, but the raw emotion in his tone was impossible to miss. By the time he finished, the chat was exploding with anger and outrage. "We ain't taking this anymore," Snoop said, leaning closer to the camera. "That man thought he could get away with this because of what I look like. Nah, not today. We gon' fight back, and we gon' make sure this don't happen to nobody else." The response was immediate. Within hours, the video went viral, trending on every major platform. Celebrities, activists, and fans alike rallied behind him, flooding social media with messages of support. The hashtag #JusticeForSnoop began to dominate timelines, sparking a nationwide conversation about racial discrimination in air travel. Meanwhile, Kevin worked tirelessly behind the scenes, pulling together a top-tier legal team. Within 48 hours, a lawsuit was filed against both the pilot and the airline. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and soon it was everywhere. "This isn't just about Snoop Dogg," one reporter said during a broadcast. "This is about deeper systemic issues that have been swept under the rug for too long." As the days passed, pressure on the airline grew. Executives scrambled to release statements, distancing themselves from the pilot's actions and promising internal investigations. But the public wasn't satisfied. They didn't just want statements. They wanted accountability. Snoop, however, remained focused. He knew this wasn't just about him. This was about sending a message. No one should face discrimination without consequences. As he prepared for the legal battle ahead, he could feel the weight of millions of voices standing with him, demanding justice. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat was taken by journalists, activists, and curious onlookers who had followed the story from the beginning. Cameras lined the entrance, capturing every moment of Snoop Dogg's arrival. He stepped out of a sleek black SUV, flanked by his legal team. His expression was calm but resolute, a man on a mission to see justice served. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The pilot, Captain Richard Wallace, sat stiffly at the defendant's table. His face was pale, his posture rigid, and his demeanor defiant. His legal team whispered frantically, occasionally shooting nervous glances at the packed gallery. On the other side of the room, Snoop's team radiated confidence. Leading the charge was a renowned civil rights attorney, a sharp, commanding woman who carried herself with unwavering determination. She had taken the case with the same resolve as her client. The trial began with opening statements. Wallace's defense painted him as a professional pilot acting out of concern for passenger safety, claiming Snoop's behavior had been suspicious, but their argument began to crumble under the weight of scrutiny. When it was Snoop's lawyer's turn, she took the floor and dismantled the defense's claims with surgical precision. Out of the graduate program. This is not a case about safety, she declared, her voice ringing out through the tense courtroom. This is a case about prejudice, about a man who abused his authority to humiliate and endanger a passenger, not because of his actions, but because of the color of his skin. The prosecution presented undeniable evidence. Witness testimonies from fellow passengers painted a clear picture of the captain's aggressive behavior. Several recounted how he had approached Snoop with hostility from the start, refusing to listen to reason and hurling insults that had no place in a professional setting. "He didn't even give the man a chance," one witness said, shaking his head as he recounted the events. "It was like he had already made up his mind about Snoop before he said a single word." Another passenger described the look of fear on the faces of those nearby as the captain escalated the situation. "It wasn't about safety," she said firmly, "it was about power. He was using his authority to single out a man who hadn't done anything wrong." The tension in the courtroom grew heavier with every piece of evidence presented. The defense looked visibly shaken as the truth came to light, their weak arguments unable to counter the mounting testimony against Captain Wallace. Snoop sat quietly at his table, his expression calm but focused. Every insult, every shove, and every moment of humiliation played through his mind as he listened. But now, he wasn't alone. The voices of those who believed him filled the room, demanding justice, just as he had promised. The trial was far from over, but one thing was clear: the world was watching, and Snoop wasn't backing down. A middle-aged businessman stepped up to testify, his voice steady but disappointed. "The captain didn't even give Mr. Brodus a chance," he said firmly. Before Snoop could say a word, it was like the captain had already decided who he was. The real turning point came when the flight attendants were called to the stand. Nervous at first, they slowly found their voices. One by one, they described what they had seen and the helplessness they had felt. One of them, her hands trembling, finally broke down in tears. "I saw him shove Mr. Brodus," she admitted, her voice cracking. "He tossed his things out like they meant nothing and left him there. I knew it was wrong, but he was the captain. I was afraid to speak up." As the trial stretched on, the defense's desperation grew. They tried to drag up Snoop's past, old controversies, meaningless headlines, to paint him in a bad light. But their efforts collapsed under the weight of the truth. Calm and composed, Snoop's lawyer brought everyone's attention back to the facts. "Mr. Brodus is not on trial here," she said with controlled power. "What is on trial is an abuse of authority and the racial prejudice that fueled it." The final nail in the defense's case came when the prosecution revealed the airport security footage. The courtroom fell silent as the video played, grainy but unmistakable. There it was, the captain shoving Snoop out of the plane, tossing his belongings onto the ground, and leaving him stranded on the empty tarmac. The evidence was undeniable. By the time closing arguments were delivered, the outcome seemed clear. Snoop's lawyer gave a final, powerful speech. "This is about more than Mr. Brodus's experience. This is about ensuring no one else has to endure this kind of humiliation. This is about accountability. The jury returned in under 3 hours. Their verdict was decisive. Captain Wallace was guilty of assault, misconduct, and unlawful endangerment. The judge handed down a firm sentence. His pilot's license was revoked permanently, and he would serve significant time in prison. The courtroom erupted into applause. Supporters outside cheered as Snoop emerged, raising a hand in gratitude. Reporters swarmed for a comment, but Snoop kept it simple and strong. "This ain't just about me. It's about standing up for what's right. For everyone. Justice has been served, but the fight isn't over." The moment spread like wildfire. Snoop's words went viral, and he became not just a music icon but a symbol of resilience, justice, and courage. The private jet soared peacefully at 3,500 feet, its cabin full of quiet joy. Snoop leaned back, champagne in hand, gazing out at the endless sky. The events of the past weeks had tested him, but the battle had been worth every moment. Justice was served, changes were underway, and the captain was behind bars. Laughter echoed softly in the cabin as Snoop toasted with Kevin and his team. "To the real ones," he said, lifting his glass. "We turned a nightmare into something bigger. Y'all stood with me." "Man," Kevin grinned, "this was all you. We just made sure the world saw it." As the plane began its descent over the Maldives, the endless turquoise waters below came into view. The warmth of the island greeted Snoop as he stepped off the plane. No tension, no reporters, just peace. The resort staff welcomed him with smiles and garlands of flowers, a far cry from the nightmare he had endured. Settling into his private villa, Snoop pulled out his phone and recorded a short video. "What's up, y'all? I just touched down in paradise. I gotta say, it feels good to be here. But it feels even better knowing we made a difference. Shout out to everyone who had my back. This ain't just my win, it's ours. Stay strong, stay real, and keep fighting the good fight." As he uploaded the video and set his phone aside, the waves outside rolled gently onto the shore. Snoop stepped into the warm sand, finally able to breathe. The weight of the battle was gone, replaced by the lightness of victory. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Let us know where you're watching from. Hope you see it.